initially perceived to be a win-win situation. And I say initially because we both know the truth of those negotiations and the interest that they take into account. So that's my understanding of this flexible realism as it's been put down.
It's a departure from the structural realism fronted by scholars like Miyashama.
Mm. Well, you might have to give me more context for that. It seems like you're taking this discussion into a very specific area. So how about
So,
you expound on it?
so Miyashama talks about structural realism as being a rule-based order. But we can come to that later. But let's look at the historical context of this Monroe Doctrine, its genesis, its evolution, the different corollaries that have been fronted up until now when we have the so-called Monroe Doctrine.
How about you take us through it?
What's the historical context of this?
How about you take us through it?
So this doctrine was fronted by James Monroe in 1823, and he was essentially warning European powers against interference in the Americas. In 1904, Roosevelt fronted his own corollary of the doctrine, which justified interventions in Venezuela during the debt crisis. I think this was it during Chavez? During the Cold War era, interventions like the 1954 Guatemala coup, 1973 in Chile, 1983 in Grenada, Panama Canal, 1904 to 1914. And all these events symbolized the US dominance in the Americas. And so right now, Trump is premising this national security strategy on that and saying that America is going to sort of decouple from global dominance, spreading itself across the world and looking within the hemisphere. Questions have been raised as to the confines of this hemisphere. Where does it begin and where does it end? You might shed you might tell us your thoughts on that. So the question here
Yeah.
is, do you think
Well,
this is a realistic strategic goal or is more of a delusion?
well, I think that many scholars and many reporters right now
Mm,
ignore the fact that when Trump was campaigning, he was asked, "Who do you like to be like?" And he said, I'm a William McKinley man, right?
mm,
I look up to William McKinley, who's known as the Tariff Man, first and foremost. And secondly, he's known for acquiring quite a bit of territories for the United States during the Spanish War and the subsequent and preceding wars.
mhm.
So he's clearly told us who he's like and what he wants to drive throughout his agenda.
Yeah.
And he told us this from pretty much day one.
Mm,
As to your question, as to the impacts of this Monroe Doctrine and the reality of achieving them, the goals embedded in the doctrine, I think we need to focus on perhaps the three core pillars of the Monroe Doctrine. And really, it's about it's an abandonment of multilateralism, which is
mhm.
why you have people like the Canadian Prime Minister saying that we're not seeing a modest shift in the global order. We're seeing a rupture in the global order,
Not a
right? Because,
transition, a rupture, not a transition.
yes, we're seeing a rupture.
Mm,
And this because it's about unilateralism, right? And basically limiting rival powers in regions and pursuing US interests first. And on this first key pillar, I think that um, the whole notion of multilateralism had really been called into question, not once, but multiple times, right?
mhm.
Because um, really the pursuit of multilateralism has been seen as a difficult aim for quite some time. I mean, you have the veto powers in the Security Council. You have conflicting interests amongst nations. We know that comparative advantage doesn't really leave individuals or countries better off, but really it leaves one country better off than another, right? And
Right.
therefore, this unilateralism is in response to the failure of multilateralism. And because of that, it's an aggressive push towards pursuing US interests first. And I think shrugging it off as unrealistic because of the threat of alienating allies is quite short-sighted, because we forget that the Europeans have been free riding off of the Americans in terms of security for decades now. I mean, I don't think any European country had neared the 5% obligation of their spending being towards the military. So they've been really free riding off the Americans for quite some time as regards to security. And Trump is basically calling their bluff, saying, look, you either do what I want or you stop free riding. So will the Europeans now start contributing 5% of their GDP spending towards military? I doubt that. I mean, you see countries like France burdened with debt, right? And having political systems that are constantly in crisis, right? Because of snap elections and the lack of majority in parliament and the likes. So that's the first point. I don't know if you have anything to say about that unilateralism first.
You know, I understand the point that the Europeans haven't been spending on defense, or rather their defense spending has been very marginal. And you'd argue that they focused more on their welfare state. I think right now, across the world, Europe is one place where the welfare state is pretty good in comparison to other areas or other places in the world. In places like the US, it's almost non-existent. You know, when you look at such things as health in the US, very expensive. So that could have informed the Americans' perception that, look, we are spending on defense at the expense of our welfare. You are spending on welfare at the expense of defense. So you're free riding in that regard. But when it comes to being allies, when, for example, the US rolled into Iraq, they didn't go alone. They were accompanied by allies. So much as we say that Europeans are not spending on defense, but you'd also argue that when it comes to fighting alongside Americans, they pay the ultimate price, just like the Americans. When it comes to America has been able to project power, in my view, due to the influence it has been able to marshal across the world. So America would set bases in Europe at will. So I think there is the fact that the Europeans haven't been spending much defensively. It doesn't mean that they've been free riding. There are certain things that, or certain benefits Americans have also derived from this partnership. Yeah, and for example, the latest statements by Donald Trump that Americans haven't needed the Europeans in NATO, or the Europeans have been contributing nothing in NATO, is factually incorrect for the reasons I gave, that they have been fighting alongside Americans. Canadians have. The UK sent its military alongside Americans when they rolled into Iraq, for instance. For me, it's been pretty mutually benefiting and not free riding as such. So that's why I stand with regards to the free riding argument from Donald Trump?
Well, I mean, the NATO collective defense provisions have only been invoked once in NATO's history,
Correct.
which was as regards to the war on terror the US was fighting. But aside from that, the question that we need to ask ourselves when it comes to unilateralism is, are the Europeans willing and ready to contribute their declared obligations under the NATO treaty or not? Because most of them are not. And if they're not, then Trump will simply keep calling their bluff and pushing them around. That's why you have, I mean, he's an apprentice president, right? He'll call you into the Oval Office and he'll know what you're willing to give and what you're not willing to give. And based off that, he'll push you around. I mean, that's why really we saw him really push aggressively against the Europeans, NATO, Denmark, right, Canada on the Greenland issue. That's why we saw it quite clearly play out when the Europeans were basically saying, look, we need the biggest threat for NATO is actually coming from one of its allies. And Trump said, look, the US doesn't need NATO. NATO needs the US, right? And that's also due to spending. It's due to military prowess and spending. I don't think it's an arguable fact that when you look at the need balance when it comes to security aspects, I mean, the US far outweighs in value what the European countries can contribute.
Correct. I think most European countries, especially from West Europe, have indicated their willingness to up their contribution. I think the only country that hasn't been very hot about notching their contribution higher is Spain. Yeah, but the likes of the UK, Germany, France have indicated willingness to increase their spending. So the other thing I thought we could look at is we've unpacked Trump's corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Do you think this is a return to neo-imperialism or just an extension of it when Trump says that he wants to control the Western Hemisphere and put at bay non-hemispheric competitors?
It's not a return. It's always been there. It's not a return. It's always been there. It's just that it's more naked for the eye to see now. Because really, if you're properly appraised of history, you'll know that it's been present and everly so for time immemorial, right? You know, the whole thing about you know, Trump's capture of Maduro is an act of aggression that's prohibited in the UN Charter. I think it's a moot point because we know that international law has never applied to hegemons, right?
Correct.
So why are we going to pretend for the next 15, 20, 30 minutes that it's applied to hegemons and we can enforce it? It's never applied to hegemons. Because
what is the essence of international law then? If we are going to throw away the rule-based order, for people like you who are pursuing international law, won't you be rendered useless?
Yes, that's a very, very sharp way to put it, but no, I won't be rendered useless. But international law, just like most law, requires will, right? Will to back it and will to enforce it. Who's going to enforce the UN Charter against the largest superpower in the world? Right? Nobody. Nobody ever has. if we're going to go by that logic, the war in Iraq was also illegal, right?
Correct.
The invasion of Afghanistan was also illegal. Kofi Annan said so as well, right? He said that, look, Bush didn't get UN backing to pursue the war, and the war was illegal. I think it's high time that we start considering international law not as to the letter of the law, but we start evaluating it as the political aspects of it permeate through it. We should evaluate it from public goods, I think, because we can sit here and condemn all we want and say we condemn. This was an act of aggression. It was against the letter of the law. But let's ask ourselves, perhaps, and I think this is a more mature debate to have, is the capture of Maduro a net positive or a net negative for the world? Because if it's a net positive, then the Americans, as the global hegemon, have literally advanced their power for the right thing. And there's some scholars that actually argue that hegemons can do some good things that are controversial, but not legal per se, right? I mean, it's the same argument that, Hitler was a terrible person, but he made a great car.
Say that again?
It's the same argument that goes along the lines, Hitler was a terrible person, but he made a great car, right?
So, I get it.
Really, we should evaluate things from a public good perspective.
I get that. It could be, the capture of Maduro could be a net positive, but what precedent does it set? For example, if Americans...
It hasn't set any precedent. No, it hasn't set any precedent. That's another thing that people keep getting wrong. It hasn't set any precedent. Noriega was captured and there was an invasion, right? But if you look at the legal analysis of the capture of Noriega, it's also an illegal act, right? If you look at the invasion in Iraq, that's an illegal war, right? And the toppling of Saddam was also an illegal act, right? In fact, all three are as illegal as the war in Ukraine.
So, my question was...
better advertised.
I wasn't done with my question. I meant to ask this. If Americans, because of the hegemony they enjoy, can capture anyone, and this has been happening in the 20th century, mostly, and the beginning of the 21st century, America had no peer, right? So right now we have China, which is almost a peer to the US. So if you have superpowers flying into any country and kidnapping presidents, if America can do that, so can China and so can Russia. What do you think that kind of scenario, how do you think that kind of scenario would play out? Because these examples you've given, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Noriega, Maduro, etc., these things happened when the US was didn't have a peer. Right now, China is rising pretty rapidly, and soon Chinese could walk into Taipei and pick the president, or walk into another South Asian country and pick a leader there. Or the Russians could do the same in Western Europe. I know it's a bit hypothetical scenario, but what do you think about that? So that's why I asked about the precedent this sets.
Yeah, it's certainly a concern that's been raised multiple times, but again, it's not the first time, right, that we've been in such a position. During the 90s, the Soviet Union was basically a peer to the United States, and they were engaged in the Cold War, right? And we had the Bay of Pigs, right, which was an attempt to overthrow Castro and the revolutionary Cubans that had come to power, which failed spectacularly, right? But As a result, now we had the Soviets place nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is basically a doorstep or throwing stone away from the US. And now the Cuban Missile Crisis and the likes. I think what most people tend to discount is that the rise of China is not a particularly bad thing, because these superpowers will keep each other in check, knowing the red lines not to cross, and knowing where there's some room for maneuverability. And I will put it to you that in this case, Maduro simply was not that important to China or the likes. And the principle that you can't go ahead and do this is not enforced by belief in the principle itself. It's enforced in fear of your adversary's capabilities, right? So we've been seeing Japan, South Korea as well conducting drills. So American might surely is not something to be underestimated. Don't forget that the Chinese army is one of the largest armies, but the most untested army in history. They've never fought a war, really, right? They're an untested force. He has Chairman Xi has a brilliant army on paper, but we don't know how good it is in reality. We've seen that even the armies that we think are great, such as the Russian army, have been boggled down in Ukraine, right? I mean, one good thing that has come out of the age of the post 9/11 world is that, I mean, the American army is perhaps the most battle-tested military in recent history or in recent times. So that's my 2 cents on it. Don't you think that that's sound enough logic to appease your fears that Xi won't march into Taipei?
It's a fair point. It's a fair point. I wanted to ask you, between a multipolar world and a unipolar world, what's your preference? What promises a safer world, a more prosperous world?
Well, I think I'd like to hear your 2 cents on that first, so that I can also reflect on it. Perhaps I'm just regurgitating information, and maybe I need to hear your views and reflect as well.
I would go for multipolarity. And I'll just borrow your logic that when you have competing powers which who are equally peers, then there'll be more stability and less imperialism. But someone would also say that when there are peers, there'll be no one to guide anyone. And so that might lead to encroachment of hemispheric territories, if you were to go with that spheres of influence argument. The same thing when people argue whether nuclear wars keep the world safe or not.
Mutually assured destruction.
Because of the mutually assured destruction doctrine. So I would go with multipolarity.